One of the first holiday specials I ever released was a short documentary episode about the history of Halloween, in which I briefly touch on the ancient Celtic festival of Samhain and how it influenced our modern Halloween. This year, I'd like to finally turn the focus to Samhain itself, and since I'm going to be saying it quite a bit, we should probably first get the pronunciation out of the way. In popular culture, it's often pronounced Samhain or Samhain, which is incorrect. The Irish alphabet is based on the Latin alphabet, which had been introduced to Ireland in the 5th century by British missionaries. It lacks the letter W, and the MH in the middle of the word Samhain represents a kind of hiatus between syllables, which is generally pronounced with a W sound, Samhain or Samhain. I first became acquainted with the word through Irish mythology and, strangely or not so strangely, through the music of Glenn Danzig. After his time in the punk band The Misfits, Danzig started another band which he named after the Celtic festival. But since the internet wasn't really a thing yet back then, you couldn't just jump online to find the proper pronunciation. So people generally went around pronouncing it how it looked, Samhain or Samhain. From what I could glean online, Danzig himself accepts both the proper Gaelic pronunciation and or the incorrect phonetic pronunciation regarding the band's name. But if you listen to his lyrics, he always pronounces it correctly, such as wait on the Samhain of my soul, or seek the warmth of the Samhain fire. The Gaels, not to be confused with the Gauls, another group of Celtic peoples, native to ancient Gaul, which was comprised of what is now modern-day France and other surrounding areas, were and are a Celtic ethno-linguistic group. Gaelic culture and language originated in Ireland, but spread to the west of Scotland, and by the Middle Ages came to dominate the rest of Scotland, as well as the Isle of Man. There were also Gaelic settlements in Wales, as well as other parts of the British Isles, such as Cornwall and Devon. It was the Gaels who historically observed or celebrated Samhain. It should be noted while on the topic of these Gaelic settlements that to this day there is a similar festival by the name of Calan Gaeaf in Wales. It's observed on the 1st of November, and the night before is Nos Calan Gaeaf, or Ysbrydnos, Spirit Night, during which people traditionally tend to avoid places such as crossroads and churchyards where spirits are thought to gather. Versions of what is essentially the same holiday as Calan Gaeaf, with slight name variations, can be found in Cornwall, as well as in Brittany, the northwesternmost region of France, which has deep Celtic roots. Samhain, to a somewhat large degree, is still shrouded in mystery, its roots reaching back into the mists of the pagan past. In the early medieval period, Christian monks working as scribes had translated and catalogued a number of Irish myths and stories that had traditionally been conveyed via oral tradition. Although some of these do mention Samhain, nevertheless, much of what we know about the festival wasn't recorded in detail until the early modern period, an era spanning from around the beginning of the 16th century to the beginning of the 19th century. What we know is that Samhain was one of 4 major Gaelic Celtic pagan seasonal festivals, along with Imbolc, spelled and sometimes pronounced Imbolc, Beltane and Lunasa. Imbolc or Imbolc marked the beginning of the spring. It's traditionally observed on February 1st, falling about halfway between the winter solstice and spring equinox. Like many pagan holidays, it was eventually Christianized, becoming St. Bridget's Day. Beltane, a Gaelic May Day festival, marked the beginning of summer and was or still is observed on May 1st. And Lunasa, named for the Celtic god Lu, is a festival marking the beginning of the harvest season, observed on August 1st, or about the halfway point between the summer solstice and the autumnal equinox. Samhain, along with Beltane, are thought to have been considered the most important of the four, with Beltane marking the beginning of summer, or lighter half of the year, and Samhain marking the beginning of winter, or the darker half of the year. Samhain was or is traditionally observed on November 1st, but since for the Celts the day both ended and began at sunset, the observances or festivities began on the night of October 31st. Like Imbolc or Imbolc, Samhain was eventually assimilated and Christianized, merging with or being replaced by All Saints' Day, also known as the Feast of All Saints, Feast of All Hallows Day, or Hallowmass, since, like Samhain, All Saints' Day was and is observed on November 1st, October 31st, the night before, became All Hallows' Eve. Whether the November 1st date was chosen simply to coincide with an eclipse Samhain seems to be a matter of contention. There was apparently a tradition in the early church of honoring all Christian martyrs with a feast day on May 13th, going back to the 4th century. On that same day, May 13th, Pope Boniface IV, on either 609 or 610 AD or CE, Common Era, consecrated the Pantheon in Rome to the Virgin Mary and all the martyrs, making it a yearly holiday or holy day that still persists in Rome to this day. Some sources suggest November 1st became All Saints' Day because in the 8th century, Pope Gregory III either dedicated an oratory to all the saints, martyrs, apostles, etc. in St. Peter's Basilica on November 1st, or held or convened a synod to condemn iconoclasm on that day. An 8th century scholar, clergyman, and poet known as Alcuin of Northumbria or Alcuin of York may have also played a part. He apparently suggested the November 1st date for All Saints' Day to his friend Arno of Salzburg in the 790s. Alcuin was a trusted advisor to King Charlemagne, and he may have used his influence with the king to help introduce the Feast of All Saints, which had been traditionally observed in Ireland and Northumbria, to the Frankish kingdom. Historian Ronald Hutton, who I'm rather fond of, having seen him in a number of documentaries over the years, apparently states in his book Stations of the Sun, A History of the Ritual Year in Britain, that there's evidence to suggest that by the year 800 there were churches in Ireland, Northumbria, and Bavaria that were in the practice of holding a feast in honor of all the saints on November 1st. In 835, the Emperor Louis the Pious, King of the Franks and son of Charlemagne, at the request of Pope Gregory IV, made the November 1st date for All Saints' Day official, declaring it a so-called Day of Obligation throughout the Holy Roman Empire. Eventually, November 2nd would become All Souls' Day, a day to pray for the dead in purgatory. The three holidays, All Hallows' Eve, All Hallows or All Saints' Day, and All Souls' Day would collectively come to be regarded as a three-day observance known as All Hallowtide, also known simply as Hallowtide, All Saints' Tide, or All Hallowmass season. This still leaves the question of whether November 1st, at least in some areas, namely the British Isles, may have been chosen, at least in part, as the date for All Saints' Day because it coincided with Samhain. This does seem to be the view of some scholars, including James Fraser, who I'll be reading from in a bit, and I know James Fraser may be considered outdated by some, but I still appreciate his work, and I have a great affection for the Golden Bough, which I recently mentioned in a Crowley episode. And if memory serves me right, due to some brain glitch, I may have been pronouncing it the Golden Bough, so if you go back and listen to that episode, please forgive me. Aforementioned scholar Ronald Hutton, on the other hand, as strange as it might sound, believes the November 1st date may be of German rather than Celtic origin. And then, according to some Catholic sources I found, certain historical documents, specifically martyrologies from the 8th or 9th century, suggest that in Ireland, the early medieval church celebrated the Feast of All Saints on April 20th instead of November 1st to avoid associations with the pagan harvest festival Samhain, which took place at that time. So it gets rather confusing. This might be a good time to segue into the topic of the etymology of the word Samhain. The fact that it or derivatives of it are Gaelic for November would seem to attest to the idea that this has long been the time of year at which it was traditionally observed. The month name for November in Irish or Irish Gaelic seems to simply be Samhain, while in Scottish Gaelic it appears to be Insavin, spelled A-N, and then T-Samhain. In the Manx language, the month name for November is quite different, being Mihauna, but they still celebrate Samhain, which they spell S-A-U-I-N, on October 31st in the form of a Celtic New Year festival called Hop-tu-Naa. One popular Hop-tu-Naa custom is the carving of turnip lanterns. As I've covered in detail in past episodes, the carving of scary faces or designs into root vegetables such as turnips to create lanterns is a Samhain or Halloween tradition found in a number of regions throughout the British Isles, especially Gaelic regions, including, as just mentioned, the Isle of Man, as well as Scotland and, of course, Ireland. The carving of turnip lanterns is also a part of pumpkin night traditions in Somerset, England. But to return to the etymology of Samhain, if we dig deeper, there's the suggestion that Samhain may come from a Proto-Indo-European word for summer. But this is challenged by some scholars, such as American historian and linguist John T. Koch, I think it is, who specializes in Celtic studies, and poses the question, why would a festival marking the beginning of winter draw its name from a word for summer, Samhain traditionally being thought of as summer's end, or the end of the harvest season? One thing I found very interesting or fitting is that apparently, according to French linguist Xavier Dulamar and Croatian linguist Ranko Matisovic, Samhain is derived from a Proto-Celtic word by way of a Proto-Indo-European word meaning reunion or assembly, or more specifically, assembly, and then, feast of the first month of the year. And the Proto-Celtic word I alluded to, and I couldn't find the proper pronunciation, the spelling is S-A-M-O-N-I, but if it's similar to Samhain, I'm not sure what the M is doing, if it's muted or silent, but that same word appears as a month name on a bronze plaque known as the Collini calendar, dating to 2nd century Roman Gaul. And once again, Gaul, what would have been essentially modern-day France and some surrounding areas, was a Celtic region as well. But further confusing things, some suggest apparently that that same word, S-A-M-O-N-I, may be linked to yet another Proto-Indo-European word different than the one I alluded to earlier, which also means summer. One thing I've learned from researching numerous historical topics, either for this show or for my own edification, is that often the more deeply you dig into history, the more uncertain you become. To that point, Samhain has long been thought of as the Celtic New Year, an idea proposed by Sir John Rhys, a Welsh scholar and professor born in 1840. He was a fellow at the British Academy who specialized in Celtic studies, being the first professor of Celtic at Oxford University. The idea of Samhain as the Celtic New Year was also popularized by the aforementioned folklorist and social anthropologist James Frazer, who I believe to some extent was influenced by Rhys. Although Fraser did apparently admit that the evidence could be seen as somewhat inconclusive, some modern scholars, such as, once again, Ronald Hutton, push back against this idea that Samhain was regarded as the Celtic New Year, with Hutton specifically referring to the evidence as quote-unquote flimsy. In fairness to scholars of the past, there does seem to be compelling evidence that Samhain, or the time of year traditionally associated with it, was and still is in some parts regarded as the Celtic New Year. Both Rees and Fraser, for instance, noted how on the Isle of Man, as I touched on a moment ago, the 31st of October was sometimes referred to or regarded as New Year's or New Year's Eve. In fact, while researching this episode, I came across a video on YouTube of a group of older women, I don't want to be insulting, but I guess we could say elderly women, carving turnip lanterns for Hop-tu-Naa on the Isle of Man, and they mentioned that as children they were unaware of the history behind the holiday, but as they got older, they had learned that it was the Celtic New Year. I'll read a bit from Fraser's The Golden Bough, and by a bit I mean at least 3 hefty paragraphs. Among the Celts of Ireland, a new fire was annually kindled on Halloween, or the Eve of Samhain as they called it, the last day of October, from which the Irish New Year began. And all the hearths throughout the country are said to be relighted from the fresh fire. The place where this holy flame was lit bore the name of Clachta, and it offers 2 similar spellings. It has been identified with a rath or native fort on the hill of a ward near Atboy in the county of Meath. And a quick note, I've heard multiple pronunciations of that county name. I've heard Meath and also Ma. And there's also what I assume is an older Gaelic version of the name, Unvi. But I'll continue. It was there, says the old Irish historian Geoffrey Keating, that the festival of the fire of Clachta was ordered to be held, and it was thither that the Druids of Ireland were wont to repair and to assemble in solemn meeting on the eve of Samhain for the purpose of making a sacrifice to all the gods. It was in that fire at Clachta that their sacrifice was burnt, and it was obligatory under pain of punishment to extinguish all the fires of Ireland on that eve, and the men of Ireland were allowed to kindle no other fire but that one, and for each of the other fires, which were all to be lighted from it, the King of Munster was to receive a tax of and I am unable to pronounce this particular Gaelic word. I couldn't hunt down the proper pronunciation, but it goes on to explain, that is of 3 pence, because the land upon which Clachta was built belongs to the portion of Meath, which has been taken from Munster. I'll continue. The 2 great Celtic festivals of May Day and the 1st of November, or to be more accurate, the eve of these 2 days, closely resemble each other in the manner of their celebration and in the superstitions associated with them, and alike by the antique character impressed upon both, betray a remote and purely pagan origin. The festival of May Day, or Beltane as the Celts called it, which ushered in summer, has already been described. It remains to give some account of the corresponding festival of Halloween, which announced the arrival of winter. Of the 2 feasts, Halloween was perhaps of old the more important, since the Celts would seem to have dated the beginning of the year from it rather than from Beltane. In the Isle of Man, one of the fortresses in which the Celtic language and lore longest held out against the siege of the Saxon invaders, the 1st of November, Old Style, has been regarded as New Year's Day, down to recent times. Thus, Manx mummers used to go around on Halloween, singing in the Manx language a sort of Hogmanay song, which began, "Tonight is New Year's night, Haganay." And I mentioned earlier that the Manx have the New Year's or Samhain festival of Hop-tu-Naa, And here it mentions Hogmanay, which is a related term which is also used by the Scottish for the last day of the old year or for New Year's. But I'll continue, and here Fraser actually mentions Rhys, one of Sir John Rhys's Manx informants, an old man of 67, had been a farm servant from the age of 16 till he was 26 to the same man near Regby, I think it is, in the parish of Andreas, and he remembers his master and a near neighbor of his discussing the term New Year's Day as applied to the 1st of November, and explaining to the younger men that it had always been so in old times. In fact, it seemed to him natural enough, as all tenure of land ends at that time, and as all servant men begin their service then. In ancient Ireland, as we saw, a new fire used to be kindled every year on Halloween, or the eve of Samhain, and from this sacred flame, all the fires in Ireland were rekindled. Such a custom points strongly to Samhain, or All Saints' Day, the 1st of November, as New Year's Day, since the annual kindling of new fire takes place most naturally at the beginning of the year, in order that the blessed influence of the fresh fire may last throughout the whole period of 12 months. Another confirmation of the view the Celts dated their year from the 1st of November is furnished by the manifold modes of divination, which, as we shall see presently, were commonly resorted to by Celtic peoples on Halloween for the purpose of ascertaining their destiny, especially their fortune in the coming year. For when could these devices for prying into the future be more reasonably put in practice than at the beginning of the year? As a season of omens and auguries, Halloween seems to have far surpassed Beltane in the imagination of the Celts, from which we may with some probability infer that they reckon their year from Halloween rather than Beltane. Fraser also in the Golden Bough suggests that November 1st would have held little importance for European crop growers, but great importance for herdsmen who practice seasonal transhumance, if I'm pronouncing that right. Transhumance refers to the practice of moving livestock in accordance with a seasonal cycle, and indeed Samhain was the time when cattle would be brought back down from the summer pastures and livestock slaughtered in preparation for the winter. Fraser further speculates that the festival may have thusly had pastoral origins. Samhain was thought to be a time of the year when the wall or barrier between our world and the other world weakened or thinned, allowing otherworldly beings and the spirits of the dead to cross over into our world, and vice versa. Stories abound of hapless mortals getting lost in the other world on Samhain night. Some of these otherworldly beings are known as the Ishi, spelled Aossi, people of the fairy mounds, comparable to, well, fairies or elves. They're sometimes described as the descendants of the Tuatha-Dé-Danann, a supernatural race of gods or godlike beings in Celtic mythology. Some scholars speculate that these spirits and fairies, the Ishi, may be the diminutive remnants of the old gods or nature spirits, whose role was downplayed in the wake of Christianity. There are a number of real-world sites which tradition describes as quote-unquote gateways to the otherworld, from which otherworldly beings and spirits were said to emerge on Samhain, such as County Roscommond's Cave of Cruachan. A number of stories from Irish mythology mention Samhain or the otherworld. For instance, a story known as the Wooing or Courtship of Emer tells of how the legendary hero Cuchulainn endeavors to woo Emer, the woman he would one day marry. At one point, Emer mentions Samhain, saying, "No one comes to this plain unless he has achieved the feat of leaping over 3 walls, killing 3 groups of 9 men with one blow, yet leaving my 3 brothers, one of whom is in each group unharmed, and then accompanied by them and my foster sister, bringing my weight in gold out of Fergal's stronghold. I see a fair plain, I could rest my weapon there. No one comes to this plain unless he has gone without sleep. From Samhain to Imbolc or Imbolc, from Imbolc to Beltane, and from Beltane to, and here is a Gaelic phrase that I am unsure how to pronounce, but I looked it up, and apparently it's basically another name for Lunasa. So basically from Beltane to Lunasa. And Cuchulainn responds, "Everything you have commanded I will do," said Cuchulainn. And I found another version that contains the following, and I could be wrong, but I think these are Cuchulainn's words. "That I shall fight without harm to myself from Samhain, the end of summer. For 2 divisions were formerly on the year, summer from Beltane, in parentheses the 1st of May, and winter from Samhain to Beltane." I encountered multiple sources that claim a text known as the Boyhood Deeds of Finn, or Fen, or Finn McCool, another of Irish legend's greatest heroes, tells of how on Samhain night, Finn slew an incendiary being known as the Fire Breather or Burner, Aelin, I think that's it, one of the Tuatha Danann. However, I read and downloaded multiple versions of the text, and maybe they were abbreviated or abridged, but I couldn't find the story in any of them. I did, however, find it in another text, known in English as Tales of the Elders of Ireland, and I'll just read a brief synopsis from Oxford Reference. "The burner who brought destruction upon Tara, until he was slain by Finn MacCool on the latter's first visit there. Aelin was a fairy musician of the Tuatha Danann, who resided at She, and I think it's Finnachid, so She would mean a fairy mound or knoll, so it's referring to a certain entrance or to the other world or a certain knoll. Also home at different times to Lear, another god of the Tuatha Danann. Every Samhain, Halloween, Aelin would come to Tara, playing on his timpan, and I believe that is a kind of predecessor to the harp. It's a kind of old Irish stringed instrument. After the men of Tara were lulled to sleep by his music, Aelin would spew forth flaming rock from his mouth and burn the dwelling to the ground. Each year, Tara would be rebuilt, and for each of 23 years, Aelin returned until Finn arrived on the scene. The hero first made himself immune to Aelin's musical charms by inhaling the poison of his own spear, whose point was so venomous as to forbid sleep. After this, Finn skewered Aelin with his poisoned point. What I did find in the Boyhood Deeds of Finn was a similar story in which Finn slays another preternatural enemy on Samhain, a being named Aed, I think it is, who from what I could glean may be a god of the underworld in some stories. Every Samhain, men of Ireland would come to woo a beautiful maiden who lived in a fairy mound, always resulting in one of them being killed. And I'll read a bit. "At that time there was a very beautiful maiden in Brí Éala, I think it is, which is linked or another name for or a part of a version of the name of the real-life site, Cruachan, which I mentioned earlier. Yes, I believe Crohan Hill is also known as Cruachan Brí Éala. Probably butchering something there, but I'm doing the best I can. But I'll continue with the story. That is to say, in the fairy knoll of Brí Éala, and the name of that maiden was Éala. The men of Ireland were at a feud about that maiden. One man after another went to woo her. Every year on Samhain, the wooing used to take place, for the fairy mounds of Ireland were always open about Samhain. For on Samhain nothing could ever be hidden in the fairy mounds. To each man that went to woo her this used to happen. One of his people was slain. This was done to mark the occasion. Nor was it ever found out who did it. And it mentions 2 fairy mounds or knolls. When Finn was there between them on Samhain night, he saw the 2 fairy mounds opened around him, even the 2 strongholds, their ramparts having vanished before them. And he saw a great fire in either of the 2 strongholds, and he heard a voice from one of them. And then it goes into a back and forth dialogue between 2 occupants of these fairy mounds. And I'll skip down a bit. The time was Samhain. The man came past Finn to reach the other fairy mound. Finn made a cast with the spear of Fiaha, I think it is. And I don't want to butcher the entire name, but it's referring, I believe, to the one of the legendary High Kings of Ireland, who gave Finn his spear. He hurled it southward from him, towards Slieve Marge, or Slieve Margi, I believe. There's a couple of ways to pronounce it, and I should mention it's another real-world location in Ireland. Then said Finn, if the spear should reach any one of us, may he escape alive from it. I think this a revenge for my comrade. That passed till forthwith he heard a lament, and a great wail, saying, on the barrow by a sharp-pointed spear. Aid, and it gives his father's name here, and in some versions he's described, Aid, if it's the same Aid, is described as the son of Lear or of Dagda, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's a different name here. But Aid has fallen. By the spear of Fiaha, Finn has slain him. Venom is this spear, and venomous he whose it is, venomous whoever threw it, venom for him who it laid low. And it goes on to describe or reveal how it was Aid who had been killing one of the suitors every year because he himself was in love with the maiden. And it also describes how Finn seized the maiden and made her promise that she would toss his spear out to him if he let her go. Outside the fairy mound of Cruachan Briella, Finn seized a woman and pledged for his spear. The woman promised to send out the spear if he released her. Finn let the woman from him into the knoll. Then as she went into the knoll, the woman said, venom the spear, and venom the hand that threw it. If it is not cast out of the knoll, a Murran will seize the land, and I believe a Murran is a disease or infection. Thereupon the spear was thrown out, and Finn took it with him to where Fiaha was. Other stories featuring Finn involve Slieve-na-Mon, hopefully I'm not butchering that, a mountain in County Tipperary, with cairns thought to be portals to the otherworld. In one, Finn slays yet another otherworldly being who emerged from a cairn and stole a pig from Finn and his men. An otherworldly woman closes the door on Finn's thumb. Since his thumb had been in the otherworld, when he puts it in his mouth to soothe it, he gains great wisdom. This is similar to the famous story involving the salmon of knowledge, in which Finn gains knowledge by sucking his thumb after burning it on a magical salmon he had been cooking. I also encountered an intriguing story about 3 werewolf sisters who emerge from a cave every year on or around Samhain. A heroic minstrel by the name of Cas Coric, I think it is, a magical harper of the Tuatha Dé Danann, beguiles them with his music after convincing them to take human form, and then either he or his companion slays them. But full disclosure, none of the versions I was able to access mention Samhain. That doesn't mean that none do. In fairness, some versions were hidden behind a paywall. The Ectra Neri, or the Adventures of Nera, tells of Nera, a warrior of Connacht. One Samhain, the king Alil offers a prize to any warrior brave enough to go out and place a wicker ring on the ankle of a hanged corpse. The deed was regarded as considerably dangerous due to it being Samhain, when creatures from the otherworld were about and the dead were empowered. I found a text that contains both the original Gaelic as well as an English translation. The Gaelic version uses the word Samhain, while the English translation replaces it with Halloween. I'll read a bit. One Halloween, Alil and Maeve were in Rath Cruachan with their whole household. They set about cooking food. And I know this is supposed to be a serious episode, but I can't help myself. I copy and pasted some of the text from an old photocopied version online, and when I pasted it, it mistranslated the word hanged as banged. So it reads, 2 captives had been banged by them the day before that. It should be hanged by them. Totally changes the story, but continues, then Alil said, who would now put a I think this is an archaic word that must be referring to what is described as a wicker ring. It says a withe, or with, W-I-T-H-E, round the foot of either of the 2 captives that are now on the gallows, shall have a prize for it from me, as he may choose. Great was the darkness of that night, and its horror. And demons would appear on that night always. Each man of them went out in turn to try that night, and quickly would he come back into the house. I will have the prize from thee, said Nera. I shall go out. Truly you shalt have this, my gold-hilted sword here, said Alil. And so Nera dons armor. He goes out to the 2 captives, their hanged bodies hanging from the gallows, attempts to put the ring around one of their feet or ankles, and it springs off 3 times. And the dead man actually assists Nera. He speaks up and says, unless you do it properly by using a peg, you'll be at it all night. And so Nera follows his advice, succeeds in placing or affixing the ring, and the dead man says, that is manly, O Nera. And Nera replies, manly indeed. And the dead man continues, by the truth of thy valor, take me on thy neck, by which I believe he means over his shoulder, that I may get a drink with thee. I was very thirsty when I was hanged. And then they go off to drink together. And the story continues, and Nera eventually ends up in the other world where he finds a wife. And I believe Cuchulainn features in the story briefly. Nera has a cow stolen while he's sleeping by this fierce goddess of battle known as the Morrigan, who is basically the nemesis of Cuchulainn. And Cuchulainn ends up freeing the cow, which eventually makes its way back to Nera and his fairy wife. And there's this tension between the humans and the Ishi, the people of the fairy mounds. And Nera's caught in the middle. He's a loyal warrior, and on the other hand, he also has a wife and child in the fairy realm. And so as I understand it from reading the story, it seems like war or invasion are imminent. Either the humans are going to come and try to destroy the Shi, or vice versa. And so Nera's wife says to him, rise out now, lest thy warriors come, she said. This host cannot go for a year till Halloween next. They will come on Halloween next. For the fairy mounds of Erin, Ireland, are always opened about Halloween. And speaking of Cuchulainn, there's also a story known as, in English, the Sickbed of Cuchulainn, which begins with the titular hero and the men of Ulster gathered during Samhain. Here's a couple more hefty passages from Fraser's The Golden Bough, in which he talks about the role of spirits and fairies and the supernatural on Halloween. Another circumstance of great moment which points to the same conclusion is the association of the dead with Halloween, not only among the Celts, but throughout Europe. Halloween, the night which marks the transition from autumn to winter, seems to have been of old the time of year when the souls of the departed were supposed to revisit their old homes in order to warm themselves by the fire and to comfort themselves with the good cheer provided for them in the kitchen or the parlor by their affectionate kinsfolk. It was perhaps a natural thought that the approach of winter should drive the poor, shivering, hungry ghosts from the bare fields and leafless woodlands to the shelter of the cottage with its familiar fireside. Did not the lowing kine, and kine I believe is archaic for cow, then troop back from the summer pastures in the forests and on the hills to be fed and cared for in the stalls, while the bleak winds whistled among the swaying boughs and the snowdrifts deepened in the hollows? And could the good man and the good wife deny to the spirits of their dead the welcome which they gave to the cows? But it is not only the souls of the departed who are supposed to be hovering unseen on the day when autumn to winter resigns the pale year. Witches then speed on their errands of mischief, some sweeping through the air on besoms, which as I understand it is a term for a kind of handcrafted broom made from twigs bound around a stick. Others galloping along the roads on tabby cats, which for that evening are turned into coal-black steeds. The fairies too are all let loose, and hobgoblins of every sort roam freely about. In South Uist and Eriskay, there is a saying, Halloween will come, witchcraft or divination will be set a-going. Fairies will be at full speed, running in every pass. Avoid the road, children. In Cardiganshire on November Eve, a bogey sits on every stile. On that night in Ireland, all the fairy hills are thrown wide open, and the fairies swarm forth. Any man who is bold enough may then peep into the open green hills, and see the treasures hidden in them. Worse than that, the cave of Cruachan in Connacht, known as the Hellgate of Ireland, is unbarred on Samhain Eve or Halloween, and a host of horrible fiends and goblins used to rush forth, particularly a flock of copper-red birds, which blighted crops and killed animals by their poisonous breath. The Scotch Highlanders have a special name, Saunasa or Saunasach, derived from Samhain All Hallows, for the dreadful bogies that go about that night stealing babies and committing other atrocities. And though the fairies are a kindlier folk, it is dangerous to see even them at their revels on Halloween. A melancholy case of this sort is reported from the Farintosh district of the Highlands, though others say that it happened at the slope of Big Stones and Harris. 2 young men were coming home after nightfall on Halloween, each with a jar of whiskey on his back, when they saw, as they thought, a house all lit up by the roadside, from which proceeded the sound of music and dancing. In reality, it was not a house at all, but a fairy knoll, and it was the fairies who were jigging it about there so merrily. But one of the young men was deceived, and stepping into the house joined in the dance. Without even stopping to put down the jar of whiskey, his companion was wiser. He had a shrewd suspicion that the place was not what it seemed, and on entering he took the precaution of sticking a needle in the door. That disarmed the power of the fairies, and he got away safely. Well, that day, 12 months, he came back to the spot, and what should he see but his poor friend still dancing away with the jar of whiskey on his back. A wary man was he, as you may well believe, but he begged to be allowed to finish the reel which he was in the act of executing. And when they took him out into the open air, there was nothing of him left but skin and bones. Again, the wicked fairies are apt to carry off men's wives with them to fairyland, but the lost spouse can be recovered within a year and a day, when the procession of the fairies is defiling past on Halloween, always provided that the mortals did not partake of elfin food while they were in Elfinland. And that's it from Fraser, for now. Samhain was a time to appease the Sidhe or fairies and various other bogies, as well as the souls of the dead. The honoring or veneration of the dead seems to be a point where Samhain and All Saints' Day neatly overlap or merge. Perhaps this point of compatibility aided in the Christian assimilation of Samhain. There were various methods for propitiating or warding off the spirits or fairies, such as leaving food or drink or a portion of the crops outside for them. And as mentioned by Fraser, in the case of the souls of the dead who had returned, places were set for them at the dinner table, and the hearth or fire was lit for them as kind of gestures of welcome. People would often stay close to home on Samhain night, and if they had to travel, might engage in what we would deem superstitious practices, like turning their clothes inside out, or carrying salt or iron to ward off the Sidhe or spirits. In Ireland, there's something known as a partial, a small woven cross similar to a God's Eye or a St. Bridget's cross, fashioned from materials such as rowan wood and wheaten straw, It's traditionally hung up on Samhain inside the front door or elsewhere in the house to help ward off mischievous spirits, sickness, bad luck, or witchcraft. It's left hanging and replaced each year. There's an accompanying Gaelic saying, which when translated into English reads, "Misfortune, ill luck out, happiness, good luck in, from this night until a year from tonight." Another way to avoid being targeted by the spirits and fairies and things that go bump in the night was to pretend to be one yourself. Donning masks and costumes, guising and mumming are thought to have been a part of Samhain and then Halloween festivities since at least the early modern era. There are written accounts from Scotland dating back to the 16th century, as well as accounts from Ireland, Wales, and the Isle of Man. Costumed people would go door to door, reciting songs or verses in exchange for food. I once did a short documentary episode on the Mari Lwyd, a fascinating Welsh Christmas tradition, where someone under a sheet and carrying a decorated horse skull on a pole and accompanied by a group would go door to door requesting entry through the medium of song or rhyme and would then be denied in kind. It went back and forth until they were finally allowed entry and served food and drink. Turns out there was a similar custom in parts of southern Ireland in the 19th century. As opposed to the Mari Lwyd, the Grey Mare, the Irish version was known as, and I'm probably going to butcher this, it's spelled Lair Ban, but I think the BH is supposed to be pronounced with a V sound, so Lair Van, perhaps, the White Mare. It's thought that these are surviving examples of old hobby horse traditions from the Middle Ages, when someone dressed as or riding a faux horse would take part in a folk play or carnival or procession, dance, ritual, etc. The hobby horse in this Irish custom, very similarly to the Mari Lwyd, was composed of a person under a sheet carrying a horse skull on a pole, and also accompanied by a band, in this case of young men, and would go from farm to farm exchanging verses for food. As it's described, there could almost be an air or hint of menace to the Scottish guising tradition. Young men apparently went door to door with faces veiled, painted, or blackened, most likely from being smeared with the ashes from the annual bonfires, threatening mischief if not welcomed. As Ronald Hutton states, when imitating spirits, it was a very short step from guising to playing pranks. Playing pranks on Samhain became common in both Scotland and Ireland and led to it being nicknamed Mischief Night. I mentioned the annual bonfires in passing. It seems the lighting of bonfires had, as far as we can tell, always been a prominent part of Samhain traditions. By the early modern era, the practice seems to have been most common in parts of the Scottish Highlands, as well as parts of Wales, Ulster, and on the Isle of Man. In some parts, such as 19th century Moray County, Scotland, the door-to-door rounds made by the local boys may have been to collect fuel for the bonfire rather than food. Boys would build and light the bonfire and supposedly entertain themselves by engaging in activities like letting the smoke roll over them and jumping over each other through the smoke, and competing to see who could spread or scatter the most ashes. This brings us to a word I was previously unaware of, seining. Seining is a Scots word that means to bless, protect, or consecrate. It's derived from an older Scottish Gaelic root word referring to a protective charm. Seining usually now pertains to the practice of cleansing or blessing with smoke. In some areas, two bonfires would be lit side by side, but spaced far enough apart to pass through, and people, sometimes with their cattle, would walk through to benefit from the supposed spiritual cleansing or protective effect of the smoke. As I believe was already touched on by Fraser, there was also the practice of extinguishing or dousing one's hearth on Samhain and then relighting it from the communal bonfire. This act was thought to bond the community. To the ancient pre-Christian Celts, there may have been an aspect of sympathetic magic to the annual Samhain fires, or fire rituals. And the following is from Archaeology magazine. As Clacta was known as a goddess of the sun, the Samhain fire ceremonies could have been an attempt to recognize or even protect light and warmth against the growing darkness of winter, as well as obviously representing the sun itself. And that's the former keeper of antiquities at the National Museum of Ireland being quoted. And the following isn't a direct quote, but the article is stating that he also said, "Rituals and ceremonies carried out at Samhain offered people the chance to pray for the return of the sun and gave assurance that it would in fact come back." And I'll read another chunk from Fraser, and this time it's concerning bonfires. "Amongst the things which in the Highlands of Scotland contributed to invest the festival with a romantic beauty were the bonfires which used to blaze at frequent intervals on the heights. On the last day of autumn, children gathered ferns, tar barrels, the long thin stalks called," and this word is spelled Gainisg. I found its definition, but not how to pronounce it. Apparently it means to grow, shoot, become, wax. So it could be referring to vegetation that shoots up like weeds. "And everything suitable for a bonfire. These were placed in a heap on some eminence near the house, and in the evening set fire to. The fires were called Samhain. There was one for each house, and it was an object of ambition who should have the biggest. Whole districts were brilliant with bonfires, and their glare across a highland loch, and from many eminences, formed an exceedingly picturesque scene. Like the Beltane fires on the 1st of May, the Halloween bonfires seem to have been kindled most commonly in Perthshire Highlands." Fraser is now quoting an Englishman by the name of Thomas Pennant, I believe, who was traveling through Scotland in 1772. "Hallow Eve is also kept sacred. As soon as it is dark, a person sets fire to a bush of broom fastened round a pole, and attended with a crowd, runs about the village. He then flings it down, heaps great quantity of combustible matters on it, and makes a great bonfire. A whole tract is thus illuminated at the same time, and makes a fine appearance." And Fraser continues, "The custom has been described more fully by a Scotchman of the 18th century, John Ramsay of Ochtertyre, I think it is. On the evening of Halloween, the young people of every hamlet assembled upon some eminence near the houses. There they made a bonfire of ferns or other fuel, cut the same day, which from the feast was called Sawnag or Savnag, a fire of rest and pleasure. Around it was placed a circle of stones, one for each person of the families to whom they belonged. And when it grew dark, the bonfire was kindled, at which a loud shout was set up. Then each person, taking a torch of ferns or sticks in his hand, ran round the fire exulting, and sometimes they went into the adjacent fields, where, if there was another company, they visited the bonfire, taunting the others if inferior in any respect to themselves. After the fire was burnt out, they returned home, where a feast was prepared, and the remainder of the evening was spent in mirth and diversions of various kinds. Next morning they repaired betimes to the bonfire, where the situation of the stones was examined with much attention. If any of them were misplaced, or if the print of a foot could be discerned near any particular stone, it was imagined that the person for whom it was set would not live out the year." As touched on by Fraser with the story about the Ring of Stones, Samhain was also a time for divination. It was thought that Samhain, being a liminal or twilight period, when, as discussed, the wall between the worlds was at its thinnest, and spiritual activity in contact with the other world was heightened, was an ideal time for divination. To quote Fraser, "Sometimes valuable information may be obtained from the fairies on Halloween." And so here's a relatively excerpt from Fraser's The Golden Bough. In all Celtic countries, Halloween seems to have been the great season of the year for prying into the future. All kinds of divination were put in practice that night. We read that Dahi, a king of Ireland in the 5th century, happening to be at the Druid's Hill in the county of Sligo one Halloween, ordered his druid to forecast for him the future from that day till the next Halloween should come round. The druid passed the night on top of the hill, and next morning made a prediction to the king which came true. In Wales, Halloween was the weirdest of all the, and I might butcher this, Tir Nos Ysbrydion, or Three Spirit Nights, when the wind blowing over the feet of the corpses bore sighs to the houses of those who were to die within the year. People thought that if on that night they went out to a crossroad and listened to the wind, they would learn of the most important things that would befall them during the next 12 months. In Wales, too, not so long ago, women used to congregate in the parish churches on the night of Halloween, and read their fate from the flame of the candle which each of them held in her hand. Also they heard the names or saw the coffins of the parishioners who would die within the year, and many were the sad scenes to which these gloomy visions gave rise. And in the Highlands of Scotland, anybody who pleased could hear proclaimed aloud the names of parishioners doomed to perish within the next 12 months. If he would only take a 3-legged stool and go and sit on it at 3 crossroads, while the church clock was striking 12 at midnight on Halloween. It was even in his power to save the destined victims from their doom by taking with him articles of wearing apparel and throwing them away, one by one, as each name was called out by the mysterious voice. When I was younger, I remember hearing or reading claims that the Druids used to read the entrails of slaughtered or sacrificed animals as a form of divination on Samhain, perhaps even human entrails, but I had trouble corroborating this claim. Any mentions of it seem to come from sources such as blogs, rather than online text or edu sites. That doesn't mean it didn't take place. The reading of entrails is a form of divination found in various cultures around the world. And seeing as Samhain was a time when livestock was slaughtered in preparation for the winter, it would seem to be an apt time to engage in such an act of divination. There's books, and I don't want to butcher the Gaelic because I wasn't able to find the exact pronunciation for these, but in English they're The Lore of Place Names and the Annals of the Four Masters, written by Christian monks, that speak of an ancient pagan god of pre-Christian Ireland named Crom Cruach, whose worship continued until it was brought to an end by St. Patrick, who destroyed the pagan god's cult image. Crom Cruach was supposedly propitiated with human and animal sacrifice on Samhain. This literature also claims that the legendary early High King of Ireland, Tiernmas I believe it is, and 3/4 of his people, or 3/4 of his army, depending on the source, were killed while worshipping Crom on one particular Samhain. Although there may be some archaeological evidence suggesting that the ancient Celts of pre-Christian Ireland may have actually worshipped Crom Cruach or some similar figure, it seems that the aforementioned texts, the Lore of Place Names and the Annals of the Four Masters, are most likely more myth than history. It's a bit more tame or less dramatic than reading entrails, but divination games using foods like apples and hazelnuts do seem to have been a part of traditional Samhain festivities. The following passages are from Sharon MacLeod's Celtic Myth and Religion. Hazelnuts, symbolic of divine wisdom and prophecy, were also frequently connected with Samhain symbolism, and we know that they were used as offerings in very early times. Sacred plants and animals, as well as votive offerings of jewelry, cauldrons, and weapons, were also found at many early Celtic sites. Parties and festivities were held at Samhain, and including eating, drinking, games, and divination. Apple cakes, blackberry pies, cream pancakes, and other special foods were consumed, including stampy, cakes made from grated raw potato, flour, cream, caraway seeds, and sugar, and kalkana, I've also heard kalkanin, mashed potatoes and cooked cabbage, in which small symbolic items were placed as a form of divination. A great deal of Samhain divination was connected with obtaining information about marriages or future events in people's lives. Ducking for apples and the roasting of hazelnuts frequently took place. As we know, All Hallows' Eve would eventually become our modern Halloween. Irish and Scottish immigrants brought the holiday and many of its associated traditions with them to North America. The guising and pranking that would become our trick-or-treating, the carving of frightening or grotesque faces on turnips or mangel-wurzels became our carved pumpkins. Samhain is also embraced by various modern or neo-pagan groups or movements, such as so-called Celtic Reconstructionists, who attempt to put an emphasis on historical accuracy, doing their best to resurrect authentic Samhain traditions, such as passing through twin bonfires and setting places for the dead. Whereas Wiccans seem to have their own variation of the festival, which they consider one of the major Sabbats on their Wheel of the Year, a cyclical calendar of seasonal festivals embraced by a range of modern pagans. Well, thank you for listening to this special holiday episode of The Week in Doubt. May you have a happy Samhain and/or Halloween.